Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? This week is a rather interesting selection of news items. These range from anti-vaxxers being converted, so to speak, back to the light side. There is news about just how much impact the CCP virus is really having on India's healthcare system, and a perfect demonstration of how all the efforts so far in other countries have, for the most part, been incredibly successful. Evidence of some of the oldest fossils that could be the multicellular organism that many species could be traced back to. There is more news on the SpaceX saga and how they finally demonstrated success. Timestamps for each of these can be found in the description below. Let's start with the vaccine news, specifically news on side effects to vaccines. It appears young people and women are more likely to develop side effects to both the Pfizer and AstraZeneca vaccines, according to the United Kingdom research. This has been peer-reviewed and can be somewhat relied upon. However, there is an important caveat. It is self-reported data. Admittedly, self-reported data from over 627,000 people, so you're unlikely to find that there's a large-scale conspiracy going on. Rather, this is probably reliable evidence. The study looked at people who received 1 or 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine or the first dose of the AstraZeneca vaccine. This is the sort of ongoing clinical monitoring that we've mentioned in the past. Vaccines, as with any medication, are not just approved and let go entirely. There is ongoing monitoring of possible side effects that have not been picked up in clinical studies. This is where this sort of data comes in. 1 in 4 individuals who were surveyed reported some major effects, these being notably systemic fever and headache. 2 in 3 individuals had much less severe side effects that were more temporary, such as localized pain in their arm. Most of these occurred within 24 hours of being vaccinated, and ended within 48. This is about what you can expect from most vaccines. For the most part, none of these side effects of being vaccinated are a surprise. Headaches and fever are generally closely tied together, with one being a product of the other. Fever being an indication that the immune system has taken note of the injection and is dealing with it. Localized swelling is again not that surprising and will lead to pain. The only noteworthy point is that the second dose seems to have caused a more strong response than the first. And again, this is not really that surprising. If you are looking to get a stronger immune response the second time, you can expect stronger inflammation leading to stronger side effects. Next we have an article debunking some social media fake news. That is, that there is a study demonstrating that masks aren't effective at controlling the CCP virus. This has at various times claimed it's an NIH study, which is National Institute of Health, Stanford University, and a few other places. It's also claimed that masks aren't effective. Well, unfortunately, none of these are accurate claims, and in fact, some of them are outright fallacies. The reason this entire fake news cycle has been generated is firstly that the single author of this not peer-reviewed article has a very tenuous connection to Stanford that is ultimately not leading to them being in any way associated with Stanford. It appears that they are somehow tied into the cardiology division at the Veterans Affairs Palo Alto healthcare system, and then to Stanford University through that. But as Stanford University has pointed out, the author has no current affiliation with the healthcare system or Stanford when they were doing this study, and that they were only a 1-year visiting scholar on something completely unrelated to what this paper claims. While somewhat hyperbolic, you could say that this is like a backpacker going their way through Europe, spending some time drinking beer in Bavarian beer halls, and then claiming that they're actually a German citizen. That's the first issue. Stanford has nothing to do with this. Second is the NIH connection, and this is even more tenuous. The only claim to that is that it can be found on PubMed. PubMed is something of a database and search engine that is used for various medical-related research. One of the journals that are found in this database is one that specializes in hypotheses and theories. That is, it doesn't present original research, it doesn't present evidence, but instead highlights areas where future research is needed and why it's needed in a particular direction based on various bits of information that can be pulled together. This journal is called Medical Hypotheses, and that is where you can find the article that has no association with Stanford and really has no association with the NIH. This tells you just about everything you need to know about this article. What we haven't mentioned yet, and it is rather important, articles in Medical Hypotheses do not undergo peer review. That means the claims made in it have not been reviewed. The journal itself doesn't provide original research. The author's claims to affiliation are at best tenuous and at worst deliberate obfuscation. And finally, the final conclusion reached in this hypothesis goes against established medical research and evidence. For the next piece of news, we go back to vaccines again, but this time on actual research. Research indicating that a booster for the vaccines that are currently available could be used to continue protection even against new variants that appear to be resistant to the original vaccine types. The two of greatest concern at the moment are the Brazil and South African variants. These appear to have not necessarily resistance, but means of avoiding the immunity garnered by vaccines to some extent. The evidence is there that they provide some protection still. That is, you don't get as sick for as long, but that you aren't completely immune like you would be to the original strain. This is where this first clinical trial comes in. The trial results would indicate that having the original vaccine plus a booster provides protection more than 6 to 8 months after their initial vaccination. While boosters are a desirable thing going forwards, we're still addressing some of our previous problems. These include anti-vaxxers, a group of people who deny the benefits of vaccines and make a variety of claims. Some of these individuals have garnered massive social media followings. This is where they make their money in many ways. At least one example of these people who either don't understand or deliberately misconstrue the evidence and science has now been convinced that they should be vaccinated, and it begins with getting the CCP virus vaccine. The Dallas woman in question, called Heather Simpson, has for the last few years been quite a prolific anti-vaxxer. They have, in a variety of ways, tried to downplay the benefits of vaccines and question the safety. As of mid-April, they've now been convinced that not only are vaccines safe, but necessary. They received their vaccine for the CCP virus, and only the days beforehand did they take their 3-year-old daughter to receive their first vaccine ever. The article goes into great depth on not only how this person fell into the trap of being an anti-vaxxer, but just how difficult it was to climb out of that pit. While one anti-vaxxer has turned to the light side, so to speak, we now have a clear demonstration of just how bad an idea it is not to be vaccinated. There are a variety of figureheads across the world, some more famous than others, some being local celebrities, but otherwise generally unknown. Stephen Karanya, a Kenyan anti-vaxxer doctor, is an example of a local celebrity. They have been very much against the CCP virus vaccines. There's a certain irony now in the fact that they have died from being infected by the CCP virus. They are among some of the cohort who would have been the first to receive it. Being a frontline healthcare worker, they would have been exposed and at greater risk. As a result, They, as the government for Kenya and the World Health Organization, have all pushed for frontline healthcare workers to be vaccinated. This will keep them safe and able to keep going. At least the irony in that is that he would have continued to push an anti-vaxxer rhetoric while being protected by vaccines. He was the kind of person who, despite all the evidence to the contrary, continued to push treatments like hydroxychloroquine. Then you need to consider the fact that he also suggested that being steamed would help you be treated for the CCP virus. A methodology that's not been used in medical circles since the medieval period? Next, we look at just how much benefit things like vaccines are bringing to the world. And to do this, let's look at India. India's healthcare system has been under strain for months now. And as the number of infections a day passes more than hundreds of thousands, their healthcare system has now collapsed. Some patients are left to their own devices to fight as best they can with the disease and hopefully survive. This was the ongoing concern for many developed nations in the West. The concern was, what would happen if we got to a point where the number of infected and new infected every day just kept growing? How could hospitals be set up to cope and mitigate this issue? Where could you find the resources, staff, and space? The reality was that they wouldn't have them in any professional, dedicated building. They would have to start making ad hoc hospitals. They would then still have the problem of trying to find people to staff them. The current 7-day average for new infections is over 300,000. Because of this, there aren't any beds, there isn't any oxygen. The resources just aren't there to support patients, and people are dying. In some ways, this is worse than what Italy went through. Italy had the capacity to put people in the hospital somewhere, but they didn't have respirators. They started having to triage patients. In India, it's not just that they don't have respirators and they're having to triage, they can't even access care facilities. While India tries to roll out vaccines which will do something to reduce the severity of this particular outbreak, it's not enough at this stage, and even international support with more equipment, more vaccines, more supplies like oxygen still isn't enough, simply because of the scale of the outbreak. This was the concern in many other countries, that they would face the same problems if they did not implement various controls, such as harsh lockdowns, social distancing, mask mandates, and more. The effects of the CCP virus aren't just limited to the immediate and direct impact of the virus itself. There are a whole raft of other morbidities that are either recurring or are going to make a comeback in the near future because of the CCP virus. The anticipated ones are things like a sudden spike in cancer diagnoses as people begin returning to hospitals. One of the less expected, but not that surprising, is tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is prevalent in several countries. In this case, though, we're talking about Peru. It's a respiratory infection by a microbe, and it's very hard to treat. It can take a long time for the medication to have its entire effect and leave someone free of infection. Older people may be familiar with the TB tests. This involved being injected with a that would contain some of the TB antigen and waiting to see if antibodies raised a welt in that site. The size of the welt indicated the degree of the reaction, and that would then give some idea of how much exposure a person had. It is a disease that reasonably easily spreads between individuals who are in close contact. Some of the symptoms of TB are coughing. Coughing is also a symptom of the CCP virus infection. This means it not only accelerates the spread of the TB bacterium, but also the spread of the virus, the two working hand in hand in some ways. Once you have countries in lockdown where individuals are forced into proximity of each other, you suddenly have an increased risk of infection for both diseases. Increased risk of spread is one thing, but the other is that people were unable to access treatment or get diagnoses for TB because of the lockdown. This meant that they were simply unable to deal with it, and the disease could not be addressed until lockdowns are lifted, and in some countries this has not yet happened. Because it takes a long time to get rid of TB with the right antibiotics being used, it's even more of a problem when you suddenly stop and don't resume the antibiotics for an extended period. It increases the risk exponentially of antibiotic-resistant TB. This is even harder to treat and takes longer. That means that at the moment, with such a large gap for many countries, and Peru being perhaps one of the best examples, they could well find that they now have to fight for years yet with much higher fatality rates than before to get to be under control again. While mutations in the TB bacterium are one thing, we'll move now to another genetic-related piece of news, specifically the release of genetically modified mosquitoes in Florida Keys. These mosquitoes are intended to reduce the number of disease-carrying mosquitoes in general. The way this works is that you take mosquitoes and you basically have them change a particular gene. This gene creates a lethal mutation in any offspring. By stopping the mosquito offspring from growing from larvae to mosquito, you then prevent them from carrying diseases both between people and animals. This means that if an individual's carrying something like malaria, they won't infect another individual. But then you have a raft of other diseases that are more concerning. These include Zika, dengue, yellow fever, and more. The reason they've targeted the male mosquito is that the male mosquito does not bite humans. In fact, they only drink nectar. The female mosquitoes are what bite you and drink your blood. This has allowed them to not only target the right species, but in a way that it really won't pose any harm to any other creature. Genetically modified mosquitoes remove the need for dumping massive amounts of insecticide over large areas, where there can be a lot of collateral damage. Secondary to that is that the mosquitoes do become resistant to various pesticides and insecticides over time. This means that as you work with them, they become more resilient to what's being done, meaning it requires more use each time. This means more damage that's off target. Genetically modified mosquitoes only are going to affect the mosquito species in question. The current trial has about 12,000 male mosquitoes involved that are being hatched from eggs on site, and the company that's responsible for this, Oxitec, is monitoring to see what happens, how far they travel, how well they work in culling the population, and more. Going now from the interesting genetic modifications to an incredibly tiny fossil found in the hinterlands of Scotland. This small fossil from over 1 billion years ago could be the oldest multicellular living organism and something you could call an animal that we know of. It was found in the Scottish Highlands. What is distinct about this particular fossil is it appears to be made of 2 very different types of cells that are working together. This is fundamentally the first idea of a multicellular organism that we would be familiar with now. Your skin can be made of multiple cell types. Some secrete sweat, others secrete sebum, others are there to purely provide you with protection, and that's just your skin. Consider how complicated your body is overall for that to happen. A single-celled organism is something as basic as yeast, or some bacterium, in fact most bacteria. On this basis, to go from these single-celled organisms like fungi and bacteria all the way to multi-celled organisms like yourself, it's something important, and figuring out how we got from one to the other is going to be a long process. We already have a lot of steps along the way, different organisms at different levels of complexity. This is a good point at which we can figure out some of the earliest developments that led to what we see as complex multicellular organisms. The organism found in this case looks in some ways very much like a blastocyst. Blastocyst is one of the stages of fetal development, very early on. It occurs within days of the egg and sperm meeting and becoming fertile. This takes it from having half the number of chromosomes to the full 46. The cell then begins dividing and eventually turns into a round sphere. That sphere shape is very similar in some ways to what was seen in this fossil. In less biological news and more engineering news, pasta that can assemble itself. This is not a pasta that can start from flour, eggs, and water. Rather, pasta that, as you take it out of a flat pack, will turn into the shape it should look like. There is a strong push towards reducing packaging size and wasted material. This is because most packaging inevitably goes to landfill and is not recycled. If you can reduce the size of the contents, such as pasta, which is largely air in the pack, you would be able to reduce the packet size. That's where this particular development comes in. You take the pasta from its pack where it is flat packed, put it in the pot, and it turns into the shape the pasta is meant to hold for that particular style. Now we go on to some animal-related news. That is, news related to the giant squid. The giant squid is sometimes jokingly referred to as a kraken, and releasing the kraken can be any number of things. The problem is, you don't actually see them very often. Pretty much exclusively they're found either washed up on the shore where they're dying, or found trapped in deep sea nets. In either case, this is not exactly its natural habitat, and so it's been very difficult to study them. The 14-meter long giant squid, with its huge eyes, is a sight to behold. Despite that, it's only in the last 2 or 3 years that we've been able to consistently and reliably get footage. Research into why we can never really find them or see them may circle around its giant eye. The eye could make it so incredibly reactive to any light, especially the light on cameras used in deep seas, that even that little bit of light from a red light camera is too much, and it means that they avoid it because it's painful and uncomfortable for them. Changing the kind of lights being used in deep sea cameras could allow researchers to better monitor and watch these giant squid, and ideally record more footage of them. This concept has been tested in 2012 and 2019, where they were successfully able to record footage of a giant squid trying to take their camera and its arm, as there was a lure on the end of it which was made from light meant to recreate the movement of jellyfish. The final piece of news we have for you this week regards SpaceX and the approval they had, or perhaps contract might be more appropriate, to develop NASA's moon lander. Their contract with NASA has been challenged by Jeff Bezos and his company. The challenge is being run on a very basic idea. That is, NASA had originally planned to have 2 companies doing this, but their funding was only able to supply one company. This meant that once they chose SpaceX, they could no longer award a second contract. The second contract that they claimed would have been available. As NASA has only given SpaceX the funding and contract, this is now considered non-competitive. As a result, Dynetics and Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin are arguing that they've not done the right thing. This means SpaceX has been told to put their work on hold until the Government Accountability Office, or GAO, has finished going through the litigation made by Jeff Bezos. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.